Are we getting old? Am I losing my mojo? What really happens is the reduction in hormones, particularly estrogen. When you think about midlife, perimenopause, menopause, all these hormonal changes, they are physiological primarily. People talk about brain fog.
Yeah.
You feel as if you are covered up in a gauze. Your memory, your focus, your clarity. You're seeing through a smoke mirror. Because every woman is unique. The brain, the hormones, the way she sees the world, and the social circumstances. You're doing really well and everything is amazing. And then suddenly the lights are flickering. Hang on. But doing what you know takes very effort.
Yeah.
So it's not that you've developed a new disease. It's just that the mass to hold this all together slowly disappears. All those amazing things women are because of the hormones.
Hi, I'm Gayu Lewis, a board-certified integrative nutrition, health and menopause coach and the host of the Gayu Lewis podcast. This is the space where we talk about what's happening behind our hormones, from science to mindset to everyday stories that help women thrive through midlife. Have you ever wondered, why does your brain suddenly feel different in midlife? The brain fog, the overwhelm, the emotional swings. And for some women, it feels like everything just happened overnight. And now layer ADHD and autism on top of that. Boy, women, we are suffering. But my guest today, Dr. Balu Pitchiah, a consultant psychiatrist specializing in neurodivergence, menopause, and metabolic psychiatry, he's going to unpack what's really happening in the neurodivergent brain during menopause. Dr. Balu, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward.
Yeah, I'm really hoping to get a lot of my questions in my brain. My husband he makes fun of me saying that, Gayu, you need to have a brain first to have an issue in the brain. But anyways, jokes apart, I really want to understand what's actually happening. We were amazing. I think we women are still amazing. But suddenly during midlife, we all feel there is some change that happens. Is that true, or are we just hallucinating?
I can look at it in 2-3 ways. Probably you have me on the show because I'm an expert in this and a specialist, a doctor. And when you think about it from a physician's point of view, a doctor's point of view, people come to us when they are ill. So technically, they're called patients, right? Because they're unwell.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you don't get to see a doctor. And in systems that we work in, I primarily worked in the UK and still do work in the UK and anywhere around the world, you must have a certain level of impairment for somebody to pay to get rid of that impairment. An insurance company or a government will not approve if you just wanted to see a doctor to get better without having a significant impairment. And also our classification systems, ICD or DSM, we have certain codes that we need to use. The analogy I use is, say, I know we've been discussing about your interest in food and you being a restaurateur. If you posted somebody outside a restaurant and only let people who are really hungry into the restaurant, do you think we will have these many restaurants? I doubt it.
Yeah.
So the reason why I'm mentioning this is, when you think about midlife, perimenopause, menopause, all these hormonal changes, they are physiological primarily. What I mean by that is, every woman goes through this. So why are doctors getting excited or coaches getting excited about it? And is it because we have medicalized it or pathologized it? What that means is, if I said to someone, in the restaurant that if you're not hungry, please can you leave my restaurant? How would that feel?
Yeah.
So the debate among the medical community is that, should we invite people who want to live better into the health system, or we keep them out? Is it a room, is it an area for wellness practitioners and coaches? So this is always a dilemma. So that's the underlying reason why there's a lot of confusion. So that's what I thought I'll set that area right. I can talk about pathology, but again, that goes into very specific, details into diseases. So, but I know you joked about not having a brain, but if your brain is impaired, there are people who have challenges with their brain. You need to see a neurologist, a neurosurgeon, even a psychiatrist for that matter, when you have a diseased brain. We'll come to any specific conditions that you want to talk about there. But for the purposes of our conversation today, we're talking about physiology, which means it's not a diseased brain. Yeah, it's not malfunctioning, it's dysfunctioning. It's a bit like you have an amazing car. It's just that you have lost the ability to navigate through traffic. Your music system is failing. The air condition is not on, but it still runs.
Yeah.
So then I get this question that, are we getting old? Am I losing my mojo?
Yeah.
The spark is coming off. It's not that, but we all have to accept that there will be a degree of wear and tear. And like you change your engine oil in the car, but now there are electric cars, people don't probably not worry too much about engine oil, but it's a bit like that, right? So we can go into a bit more details on that. I know I took a little bit more time, but just to set the context as to how we approach this. The people then ask me, difference between a male and a female brain. Are there anatomical differences? That is subject to debate. People are debating. Some people say there is no major anatomical differences. But what we know for certain is the influence of hormones on the brain, male and female, and the fluctuating hormones impact on the brain. And that influences their thought process, their emotions, their behavior, the actions. So when we see someone, we're seldom looking at the actual brain itself. We make assumptions based on how we perceive their behavior. You could be completely gone, but if you put up a very nice smile, thinking, wow, he's charming. Some could be, very anxious, but they're very calm inside, but their expression is that they're a bit loud and a bit all over the place. So how do you decide? So we kind of, what we call as phenotype and endophenotype. So we see someone presenting in a certain way, but it's not all what is happening within them. The challenge we have, particularly in this business, is two women come with very similar test results, but their behavior is very different. Two women can come with very similar behavior, but the test results are completely different. So this is why in an AI age, where there is a lot of information out there, we still need people who can help people navigate. So not just doctors. The doctors, I would say, although I'm one, I would say we know very, very little about physiology because we only have very small portion of our curriculum dedicated to physiology. Our focus is mainly on pathology. So this is why I think there's a lot of room for highly qualified coaches like yourself, people who can handhold, who can navigate people through the physiological changes, and also identify pathology much earlier. I think that is a greater role for people to play. I think that is one of my big interests. So preventing complications in midlife. So that's what I think we could have a deeper conversation, and that'll be very useful for your audience.
No, you mentioned about that. I like the fact because you said you took the analogy of the car in terms of the things going wrong, but we as people, we have a scheduled maintenance for our car. We take very good care of our car.
Correct.
But when it comes to our own health, we wait till really something goes wrong. Like in the car, you don't wait for the engine to fully collapse. Whereas with our body, we want it to collapse, and that's when we're like, oh, I need to go now see a doctor.
100%.
Right? And again, I think with women, I see this much more because I think the resilience is slightly higher. We always put other people's, wellness before us. And then something goes really wrong, and then you like, oh, I really need help now. But you see that also happening and again, how many people really then resort out to getting help? Because I feel that women feel vulnerable if they show any form of weakness.
100%. And you talked about midlife. I know we were starting with midlife. And the ability to advocate for oneself. I'm not talking about the social side of things, which we can discuss, but that could be for another day. When I say social side of things, oppression of women, women's rights and all of that, that's one aspect. But in midlife, your ability, this is very important, your ability to advocate for yourself goes on. So for example, now we may have modern cars which can send out data showing that they're malfunctioning. Your dashboard can show up things. But if it wasn't present, how would you even recognize? So the woman is not able, this is a sad reality with feminism or with any movements, and we talk about that's all great. But the individual woman's ability to advocate for herself in a doctor's office declines in mid-age. That is extremely important. So if someone then points this out to her, that's not going to be a pleasant conversation. Like you said, if a husband or a partner or a boss at work says, look, you've been a bit off, that's not something that can go down easily. So what is the language we need to use to help women validate these things? It's not that you're broken, but something is off. And how do you take control of that? So we need to start right there, empowering them to take action. And that doesn't have to be visiting a doctor's office in the first instance, but, starting to look at it is important.
So, I know that during midlife, and especially during the whole perimenopause, and I know you work very closely with women during this phase, we know that the hormonal fluctuation, especially with the whole progesterone, estrogen going haywire, can affect the brain. There are studies. Can you validate that, yes, whatever is happening in our brain, we are not, just making it up, and there is these hormones that are causing us, the brain fog that we face is something that's happening, and it can happen, and it happens with most women.
When I think about my own journey, looking after women, when we trained about 25, 30 years ago, when we started our first jobs in medical field, women mid-age used to present with somatic symptoms. But what I mean by somatic symptoms is they might have non-specific pain. So they're slower and they're stiffer.
Okay.
So physically, you find that your mothers or grandmothers are a bit slow. Physically, I'm not talking mentally, right? And they come to a clinic and you do a battery of tests. But those days, the tests were not really focused on the stuff that we're talking about today, hormones. No, it was just very basic. And they were given, say, painkillers or some vitamins. That's about it, right? So we have had this issue for a long time, but we're now looking at it more closely with a larger lens. And as society developed, women were taking a bigger role in the economy and using their brains more and more than our previous generation of women, right? Women's main role was running families, having babies, so managing things at home. Probably they didn't use the brains as much as they're using now. But having said that, women, or girls, when you look at the school performance, they're incredibly bright, they're very intelligent, and emotionally intelligent as well. They have roles to play in almost all industries. There aren't any industries where women aren't present, right? But then when you look at men can't give birth to babies, no matter how hard they try. So that's one area where women lead, right? So everything is in favor of women as they grow. But then, like you said, with society, they also take on responsibilities such as bringing up children, keeping everything together, if they have extended families. So they have multiple responsibilities. So everything is great. They have an increased intelligence, the cognitive ability to manage issues are there. And they're blessed with hormones. I would say that women are blessed with hormones when they're young. That gives them the glow, that gives them the ability to house a life within them. It provides the perfect scaffolding for the brain. So everything goes really, really well. So women are amazing. Think about it. Young girls doing really well in education. Beautiful women, getting into arts and, media, entertainment, getting married, having children, excellent. All good until something happens. Again, this age, midlife, which age is midlife is always a debate. But again, for the purposes of our conversation today, we kind of take 10 years before the onset of menopause. Menopause is one day where your
365 days of no period
stops. So you go 10 years before. So on an average, in my experience, I'd say 37, 38, around about that. So I would say mid-30s, early 40s. So that's a good age group. And in my experience, women are the most productive during that phase. So I also did my MBA, used to work in the city, and I have a lot of experience working with high-performing women and men. So they have completed their childbearing responsibilities. And I know it's different, but I'm talking about the larger group of population, right? And they're incredibly accomplished. Now they want to do something for themselves. They want to take up a leadership position, want to get into an entrepreneurship area, whatever they want to do. Great stuff, because they've accumulated so much knowledge and skills that they want to really display it in a purposeful way. They want to be productive. And this is when the hormones begin to fluctuate. We can go into a bit more technical. I can point out three important things that we look at.
Yeah.
So thinking about midlife, we were talking about what age is midlife, and we considered 10 years before menopause as midlife for the purpose of our conversation today. And so what really happens, and as I mentioned, it's the most productive period of a woman's life. And what really happens is the reduction in hormones, particularly estrogen.
Yeah.
So that's something that helps the brain metabolize glucose in the right way. So it helps brain have energy. So it's no point you just eating a lot. You need something to convert what you eat into energy to utilize it. Yeah, so that's main. And then it also helps with a chemical, a neurotransmitter, hormone, whatever you want to call it, dopamine, which is usually associated with an ability to be motivated, to feel pleasure. And it helps the process of making dopamine and also stops the breakdown of dopamine.
Okay.
So estrogen is very powerful in that way. It also helps with the structure of the neuron. So there have been studies to show that when the levels of estrogen is very high during the first half of the cycle, the brain is very active, the connections are very robust, and there's a sharp contrast in the second part of the cycle. So we kind of understand that to a certain extent as well. So the fluctuation in hormones, you could have estrogen 3 times the normal on a day, and the next day you could almost have nothing. That level of fluctuation really is palpable in a person who is relatively high performing. So it's a bit like flickering lights, I would call it, right? If the light is bright, you're relatively okay with that. And if it is dim, we kind of get accustomed to it. But if it's fluctuating, it becomes difficult, annoying. So that's the first thing that happens, the fluctuations, and the woman is perceiving that. And in neurodivergence, it's even more significant. We'll come to that. But this is something I think we want to hold on to that thought for a moment. So what's happening? You've done really well. Everyone says, you're amazing. And you also know that you're amazing. We'll come to the other part where people have problems with their image and other things. And then suddenly it's flickering. The lights are flickering, right? You are perceiving that. And you think, you can't do anything about it. Others are starting to perceive that. Obviously, you feel exposed. The mask is coming off. And then you go to a doctor. Most people don't, but even if you go to the doctor and if you check, it depends on when you check. As the doctor might say, well, everything is fine.
Levels are normal.
Levels are normal. Then what do you do now? So am I making it up? Am I becoming bad? Am I cranky? Is it because of problem with my boss or mother-in-law or children or whatever. So this is what gets into the brain now. So that becomes even more difficult to manage.
And you spoke about neurodivergence. You say when that kicks in, that it's at the next level. Can you talk us a bit more on that?
So neurodivergent group are incredibly interesting. Why? They can be very intelligent, but the ability to use the intelligence to integrate into a world that is designed for neurotypical people is impaired. And what I mean by that is, you may have an amazing car. Now we talk about Teslas and other cars, but if you don't have the infrastructure to keep it going, if you don't have the charges or the right roads, then the intelligence doesn't exhibit itself. So you become a misfit. And technically, from a brain chemistry point of view, you need more dopamine to regulate your emotions. And you also have what we call as an executive dysfunction. So the ability to initiate tasks, maintain focus, concentration is impaired. And then you procrastinate, making decisions become harder. So all of that is kind of present in people with neurodivergence. But because of the advantage they have with the hormones, I said hormones are protective. That's amazing. Women are blessed with this more than men. Because nature decided that they have to have all these wonderful things to help them have babies, right? And that's what makes the women the fairer gender, the pretty, whatever, right? All those amazing things women are because of the hormones. So we need it. I know at some point, people start hating that, but no, we need it, In neurodivergence, the ability to mask some of these challenges is very good when they have the hormones. So when you think about ADHD, for example, people know about ADHD as a common condition, as a neurodivergent condition. Most people think about ADHD as a condition which is mostly prevalent in boys, young boys, so climbing walls, right? Girls are usually quiet, daydreaming, distracted, they can be doodling, and they're not a big problem in the classroom. In fact, they pass off as very sweet, nice children. And they get to middle age, when the scaffolding comes off with the hormones, the mask to hold this all together slowly disappears. So it's not that you've developed a new disease, it's just that the mask that held it together is slowly coming off. And I shouldn't be saying this, but then, you know, as a middle-aged woman yourself, you see many women using makeups, many women going to parlors to have fillers or whatever, right? Oh, and what do these people say? Look, the collagen is coming off. I'm not a technical person on this. You know that they say that the scaffolding that holds things together is coming off, so you kind of artificially inject things. Same, very similar thing is happening in the brain. So the ability to be very nice. When I say nice, it's not that the woman is bad. When you don't have the scaffolding, you are subject to a higher sensory load. So whatever is happening around you is perceived very sharply. Those shock absorbers or things that smoothen some of these responses are not present. So you become a little bit abrasive, a little bit irritable. So even the mildest thing, it could be a noise, it could be a bright light, or even, I have had women who complain that the ability to perceive textures change. A piece of clothing which they feel was comfortable becomes itchy, irritable, So the perception changes because they're unable to moderate the sensory load that comes their way. So technically, this is happening within them. In addition to the loss of estrogen, which is responsible for energy, dopamine, the structural integrity of neurons, we also see the scaffolding, the cushion disappearing. And again, when I say this to women, they kind of say, oh my God, wrinkles appearing. I can relate to that. It's not that, something is wrong. It's just that what held things together is disappearing.
I know you mentioned the wrinkles. At least the wrinkles you can see. Whereas the other side, you can't really open this up and see, hey, what's happening inside. I think.
Yeah, absolutely. This is why initially I said that people judge based on perceptions. Oh, you used to be so sweet. You never talked back. It's not that, you suddenly woke up one morning and said, no, I need to talk back to everyone today. No, your ability to hold that back is less, So people talk about, I don't give a F about this, that, or the other. It is expressed as maybe aggression or irritability or whatever. But actually, it is their real, it's a form of wrinkle. It's a form of wrinkle, that your ability to hold that together and tolerate whatever shit that's thrown at them has reduced. So these two things are happening structurally within the brain. But then more importantly, as I said, they're also taking on more and more responsibilities, which means they're balancing many things. Many tabs are open at the same time. These two things, which you mentioned, reduction in estrogen and reduction in the scaffolding, has an influence on that as well. So you feel that your ability to multitask reduces. When people talk about brain fog, you feel as if you are covered up in a gauze. Your memory, your focus, your clarity, you're seeing through a smoke mirror. So, your perception completely changes. And now, you being the high performer is now evaluating your performance against the standards that you've always set for yourself. Thinking, gosh, I'm losing. What am I doing here? So obviously, you're going to be more critical of you rather than thinking that something has to be done about it. Some fine-tuning has to happen. You're thinking, no, I never used to be like this. What is happening to me? Then you start researching, looking for things. Or is it because of my high sugar? Or is it because of low protein? Or whatever, So people come up with all sorts of things rather than very deeply looking into this in a very comprehensive, structured way. So that is why what works for one may not always work for another. Combination of things is important. So in my world, I always say that an intervention to help these women will have to be customized.
Yeah.
We can't have one size fits all approach because every woman is unique.
Yeah.
The brain, the hormones, the way she sees the world, and her the social circumstances. Again, we don't really want to go too much into stress and other things, but that all adds to the pressure here.
Yeah.
So you can see it's a perfect storm happening in the midlife.
Yeah. But Doctor, I know that you touched on very, very key concepts, but a lot of time when women finally feel like, that this is not me, and then they go to a doctor, they are mostly tagged. They're not even told that this could be ADHD midlife, probably showcasing itself during midlife, but they are probably termed as, oh, you're going through some form of depression and you're given antidepressants. Why does that happen?
ADHD, as I mentioned, traditionally has been seen something that affects younger boys.
Yeah.
And when women generally have been okay, and they get to a point where they're anxious, long-term anxiety, stress, burnout leading to depression. So the training, the medical training is that, you kind of look into that, you treat it. And somehow for a long time, ADHD has always been kept as a very specialist area. It is still a very specialist area, but there's more awareness around it. So if you want to get that investigated, it takes more effort, more resources, and the resources available are not tuned to this.
Yeah.
So the scarcity of resources to assess these things comprehensively also contributed to that. That's number one. Number two, there's a lot of stigma around it, because then it goes very deep into your whole sort of brain function and structure, thinking that what is fundamentally unique about you. So people didn't come forward. But what was interesting during the pandemic was that people started spending a lot of time with themselves. And we came up with this theory that people's life was relatively manageable because of all the distractions we had. People were living for weekends, all these parties they were looking forward to. So they kind of put up with all those stuff that's happening during the week. But during the pandemic with lockdown, all of that stopped. People started spending more time with themselves. They also started spending time with people who are genetically linked to them as well.
Yeah.
Not just boyfriend, girlfriends or partners, but also parents, children. And they saw very interesting patterns emerging when they were kind of spending a lot of time with themselves. And that is when the executive functioning challenges became more apparent. And thanks to the internet, social media, a lot of people started sharing those experiences as well. So what I always believe and still tell many of my colleagues is that the internet and social media has done more in terms of raising awareness around these issues than any medical establishment has ever done over the last whatever number of years.
Yeah.
It is good, and it also has its own challenges. Sometimes everyone feels that they have ADHD. So you need to be a bit careful on that. But I think knowledge is good, and seeking professional opinion and getting the right amount of support is always important. Coming to the point about the differentiation, undiagnosed ADHD can present as many issues.
Okay.
So the way I would like us to think about ADHD is a bit like the diabetes of mental health. Why do I say that? In the past, when someone has a non-healing ulcer, you have a wound which is not healing at all, you applied everything, and someone would say, oh, by the way, have you checked your sugar levels?
Yeah.
You may have sugar. But now diabetes is not that. We could be going to your office, on the way, just visit the doctor's office and get your sugar done. Or now you have continuous glucose monitoring.
Yeah.
Right? It's completely changed. And the stigma around diabetes has changed. Diabetes used to be a dangerous disease. It's still a very serious issue. But then that was associated with amputated limbs, failing kidneys, blindness. Obviously, it's scary. But now it's different. So what I'm trying to say here is ADHD presents that way, and most people see complications of ADHD. Unruly behavior, addiction issues, relationship problems, fraud, criminal behavior, all of that, right? That's what, not ADHD, yeah? It's very difficult.
Okay.
But if you think about ADHD, some of the most creative people are neurodivergent. Half of Silicon Valley is neurodivergent. And the pattern seekers among the neurodivergent people are the change makers in the world. We need them. And in fact, they have led the world to all these wonderful advances that we've seen. But they may be difficult as people to live with, difficult social skills, But they are incredibly intelligent, and the pattern seekers, many Nobel Prize winners fall into that category as well. But we don't always give them a diagnostic label. We don't need one as well, but it's important to recognize those patterns. Yeah. So your question about why we go down the antidepressant and anti-anxiety route is that we don't have the time and resources to go deeper looking at this. So my suggestions, and particularly in our practice, we always give every woman a screening tool, which takes 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And these days, there are so many online screening tools as well. So we don't jump into conclusions saying that you have ADHD, but you say, hey, you may have a neurodivergent pattern. The way you look at yourself and the world is very unique compared to the other person. That may be your strength, but it also can be your weakness.
Yeah.
So when you talk about, again, why I mentioned diabetes, sugar is important. We thought that we die.
Yeah.
But excess sugar can be a challenge. But impaired ability to process sugar is what the disease is. This is what we're coming to. You can be intelligent, creative, loud, gregarious, entrepreneurial, risk taker. We need you. We need you, right? But we also need the ability to moderate those responses. That is what is important. We talk about moderation. So you could use some of those skills to further your career and your family, your society.
Yeah.
At the same time, you need to know when to curb that. That is the key in ADHD. So it's more of a dysregulation in emotions, challenge in initiating tasks, reduced motivation. These questions are not usually asked when someone presents with anxiety.
Okay.
So I can give you a narrative if that helps, some of your audience. Say, for example, a woman with undiagnosed ADHD presents unmasked in a clinic. What happens is her awareness of her disability increases as she ages.
Okay.
When she was young, she may have been naughty. She may be daydreaming. Parents or teachers might have commented on that, but she wasn't aware. She was this cute, sweet little girl growing up. Mid-age, she's got children, and she's thinking, calling her parents and saying, "Oh, you used to be like that." So they're thinking, is that what's happening to me? Okay, she's more aware. But then she has always had this mask. Although she was aware privately, no one saw that. Now the mask is slowly coming off. Her ability to keep her together is reducing. So now she's knowing that she'll make a mistake, that she'll not perform to her fullest ability, because she was known to be someone who always performed well, and she was well made up, well dressed, kept everything clean. But now that ability is reducing. The increased awareness with reduced ability to mask means she's naturally going to get anxious. This is not a pathological anxiety, it's a response to her increased awareness of her disabilities.
Yeah.
So when you say to her that there's no need to be anxious, she gets very upset. The response to her, in my view, is that I'll help you fix what makes you anxious, which I don't think we talk about in my world, at least in psychiatry. You're anxious, I'll give you something to fix your anxiety. But she says, hang on, I'm anxious because of this. Can you not go beyond this and help me fix what is causing the anxiety? So this is where my work in neurodivergence becomes very, very, very rewarding. And I tell people that I know, people worry about stimulants to a great extent. I say, probably after antibiotics, this has the greatest degree of success among all medicines.
Okay.
And we don't use it. We don't use it enough. It's much safer than many other medicines that we take. But people run away at the thought of stimulants. And my point to them is Amazon, Starbucks, Netflix are replacing the stimulants. So we are living in a society where there is greater evidence that we need more and more stimulants. I'm not saying that everyone should take stimulant from tomorrow, but I'm saying that we are stimulating ourselves in other means.
Yeah.
So we know that these things are essential. So when I say stimulants, it's not just taking a lot of amphetamines. It could be many things, including exercise, good sleep, sex. Again, we can't emphasize enough So the nature has given us all of these amazing things. And there are a number of nutrients which help with the dopamine and the stimulation effect as well. So it's everywhere. I know we digress, but it's very important to understand the anxiety, particularly in a woman who's never had a problem with her emotions, presenting in midlife, could be related to the things that we're talking about. And the intervention involves a lot of coaching. Why? Because you need to learn new ways to improve your executive function. Because you've been using your mask and now the mask is coming off, which means you need to put your house in order. So if you then learn how to put things in order, you may not need the mask. So how do you make a woman confident without her mask? Partly acceptance, but also improving her ability to do things. So for example, I can give you a couple of small things which you can very well relate to. People talk about, say, co-regulating. So you're feeling very anxious, you're lonely, you call a friend, you go and sit with them, you watch a movie together, you get reassurance. You co-regulate. So for example, you say, now we are living in a crisis situation, do we think that this place will come down? On your own, you're thinking, gosh, what will happen if a bomb hit my place or whatever. But when you're sitting with a friend, what's the chances of that, So you're co-regulating your emotions with somebody. And then you can outsource a lot of your admin tasks. So you're coming into a podcast room or an office and you're thinking, I need to bring my this, that, and the other. I have a long list of things and to keep all this in my head. That is going to create a cognitive overload. So what do? Download that onto a piece of paper or some device so that it's all kept there for you. So these are some of the examples. So co-regulation, downloading tasks, creating some systems around you, which means you don't use so much of your brain power to deal with this. So if you want to draw an analogy, it's a bit like the RAM, the rapid access memory in the computer, not working well. You can't overload it. Just use it for what needs to be done with it, and then the rest can be outsourced. So sometimes people have this thing that they have unlimited memory storage, and they try to remember everything, juggle so many things, and then drop a few things in the way, and they start blaming themselves. So all of that can be coached, they can be taught. But then, and again, we haven't touched upon neurodivergence, particularly the high functioning autism. And that's another very interesting area where people talk about having great difficulty in social interaction and communication.
I know a lot of women who say to me, Gayu, I used to be a social butterfly. Now I don't want to see anybody.
Correct. And that's what I mentioned, where your ability to take on some of these things has reduced. So you are shutting down. And then, that makes you feel that, you're not social anymore, right? Because the ability to take stuff reduces. Right?
Yeah, but like I said, so many women high achieving, and they suddenly, this is the sudden stuff. Like,
correct.
That is where we're not prepared. If we were prepared about, okay, this is, if you're told this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, you'll be prepared.
Correct.
There is no manual for this one.
Absolutely. Because you think about it, right? Say you're going to a very important interview and then you start your car and then few lights show up on the dashboard. You're going to blow your top. That's what is happening. Life is getting busier. You're doing really well and everything is amazing. And then suddenly the lights are flickering. Hang on. So the reaction to that flickering is what leads to pathology. And I was telling you about when do they get to the doctor? That's a very important area, right? People develop new behavior. They started smoking, drinking, having affairs, doing all sorts of random things. And people are thinking, you never used to be like this. What is happening? People make this joke about midlife crisis or whatever, right? This is real.
Yeah, but they always spoke about midlife crisis with men.
Yeah.
It was never spoken about women. They say men suddenly want to feel younger, they start having affairs. That's what we always spoke about.
But then the answer to that, right? Women have better masks than men. Who uses more makeups, Men are not very good with this, bless them. What you see is what you get. Women are incredibly clever. They can mask many, many things. They wouldn't admit this. I've had, very senior people, judges sitting on drug abuse cases, using substances secretly at home. How do you explain that?
Yeah.
It's not a moral failing. It's not a character flaw. It's chemistry. It's as simple as that. And when you fix chemistry, it changes. You can lecture them. See, they're supposed to be the guardians of law and justice. It's when the chemistry fails. I know of, this is where it is funny, isn't it? When I know of endocrinologists, diabetes specialists who have a sweet tooth and they crave sugar.
Yeah.
It's not that they don't know. I know of pulmonologists who are chain smokers. It's not the knowledge. It's the doing. So in neurodivergence, what we say is, it's not always about knowing what to do. Because these days with your phone, the internet, it's easy. Knowledge or information is easy to acquire, and that can make it better than knowledge. But doing what you know takes a bit of effort.
Yeah.
That's where the frustration comes in. And when you're intelligent, when you know what to do, but you're not doing what you know, that's even more frustrating.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you as a food entrepreneur and coach will also understand this. People say, look, I know what to do to reduce weight, but it's not happening. Yeah. So when we used to run our programs in the resort, we have very intelligent women coming to our program for reducing weight. When I say, look, we just joke with them, right? If you put in less and take out more, you will have a deficit, like in business, right? More spending means you are always going to be broke. So you want to be broke, that means you're losing. You want to lose, but that's not happening. So which means it's not just that. There's something else. So they then understand it. It's not about just like we talked earlier. It's not about just eating less or eating this or eating that. There's a number of things that are at play. And some of these most intelligent women, that we saw in our programs, they would comfort in the middle of the night. They didn't even realize. They'd come down and say, let's have a cup of coffee. I'm not able to sleep. And then open the fridge and they've emptied a whole box of cakes or biscuits.
Yeah.
They don't even realize it till the following morning. That's they're sleepwalking into this. Yeah. And they feel so ashamed the following morning. They've done that.
The guilt cycle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it happens.
Yeah.
So again, we can go on and on about it. In neurodivergence, there is a delayed sleep phase. You have great difficulty in sleeping at a certain time. You might hear more of these women being very active at night and working till like very early hours of the morning, and they feel very tired in the morning and they're not able to get up on time for work or family duties. And that's part of the neurodivergent brain. The glymphatic system. People talk about how the brain sort of gets rid of all the sort of waste material. Yeah. It's a bit like your waste processing that happens in buildings, for example, right? They have to come at night, take all the bins out and clean the stuff. So that's not happening if you're not sleeping properly. On the positive note, we can learn more about ourselves and do something about it. I guess that is where I see a huge opportunity. I know we talked about midlife, doom and gloom, and all sorts of changes, and it's difficult. But at the same time, increased awareness means you can do something about it. And there are so many things that are coming up which could help people prevent complications. We cannot do much about the physiology, right? We are all aging. Come on, we can't stop the clock. I know people talk about longevity, anti-aging, nothing against them, but we have to gracefully age. But we can certainly do something to prevent accidents. We can plan, measure, and then manage. So that's what we think we have been.
It's the quality of life. The 100%. Longevity is there, just don't add years, but add,
Equality, absolutely. So I would say midlife is manageable in terms of, any complications that can arise. But how do we make it more pleasant? It's not just that we may always need to learn different things, but we have to look at this very carefully, because our cognitive ability to manage stuff is going to be lower. So we call it as cognitive inefficiency. That's what women, particularly going through the hormonal transitions, are seeing.
But doctor, once the hormonal roller coaster is over, you've hit menopause and you're in post-menopause, does the cognitive function return back to normal since we don't see the big change? Or because now estrogen is not there, the mask is not there completely? Like the weakest form of estrogen is left in us. Does the mask completely disappear, or does it come back to normal?
So when you think about menopause, there are changes which we need to take into account. For example, with the estrogen depletion, So increase in risk of many things, the bone density to heart health and all of that. And also we see a reduction in brain functions, but that's slightly different topic to what you're asking. The fluctuation is perceived very acutely in a high performing woman.
Okay.
That is the reason for most of the distress that happens in mid-age. And women try all sorts of coping mechanisms to deal with the distress that happens because of the fluctuating hormone levels. So that's key to understand. At a lower, non-fluctuating level, the distress is lower.
Okay.
You kind of got used to living with lower level of hormones. There's not much fluctuation.
Yeah.
And you're getting wiser. And if you put things in place, you learn new skills, you learn to delegate, you then pick up your ability to manage things better. And mostly, you get most capabilities that men sometimes have post-menopause. So you see women emerging as leaders, mentoring other people, managing big organizations, less emotional. So that's all the positive things that.
So there is the rainbow at the end.
Hugely. When you look at people who have done incredible things post-menopause. So if you look at women in leadership positions, you will see many women who are at that age. You can always argue that they have a lot of experience because of the number of years they have put in the service. Of course, that counts. Yeah. But less fluctuation means better efficiency. But that counts. So if you look at the mid-age, when they're going through these fluctuations, the productive week or the productive month has been significantly impaired, right? At least 25% of a month is gone because of this. Sometimes it will be more. So that's something to look forward to. Definitely, it is not the end of everything. It is just a phase that they need to navigate with more clarity.
Okay. I was reading a very interesting book by Leela Musconi on brain health, where she speaks about that we eat for our body and everything. We hardly eat for our brain. I think it was a very fantastic stuff where she speaks about nutrition that can help, with the whole brain function, especially during the whole transition where there is a big change that happened in women's brain. What's your take on it in terms of how do we educate women to specifically start looking at eating for their brain health?
Again, as we know, we are a bunch of chemicals. It's a piece of meat with some chemicals. That's it. We could talk about fantastic things, but at the end of the day, that's what we are, right? So food is everything. More than health, I would say food. More than medicines, food is medicine. More than health, So food is everything. The challenge is when you have to deliver certain chemicals, so protein, for example, or certain enzymes in a high concentrated way with food. So if you start giving people things that sound or look like medicine, it's less appealing for them, for their taste buds. So there's no doubt about the influence of food on health, but how we take that food, that's where I think chefs probably have a bigger role to play, where how do you inspire people to make their own food in an appealing way, consume it in a way that then it reaches the final destination. Often the carriers of good things are as important as the good things themselves, right? So I think the chefs have a great responsibility in making the carriers more appealing so that people are inspired to take the good things inside them.
Doctor, that's an amazing conversation, but I think now we're getting to a very interesting segment on the podcast, which is called Hot Seat, Cold Truths.
Okay.
So it's more like a rapid fire round, whatever comes to your head for the first time.
Okay.
Yeah. Brain fog or burnout? Which one do you think women confuse the most?
I think they're clear about brain fog. They don't accept burnout. So I would say burnout is confused. Yeah.
One thing women blame on menopause, but it's actually something else.
Probably ability to care for themselves. So self-care is, I would say, it's important. I think at every age, every woman has to care for themselves. They can't neglect themselves because of menopause.
Yeah. ADHD in women, overdiagnosed or underdiagnosed?
Very underdiagnosed, 100%.
100%. I would say after today's conversation.
Yeah, very, very underdiagnosed.
When you termed me as ADHD, now I can relate why you said.
I would see, as I say, I wouldn't diagnose you, but neurodivergent. And so I kind of feel that we don't need tags for everyone, but we need that awareness to say, hey, I'm different, I'm unique, let me use that to my strength.
Okay.
Yeah.
Coffee for focus, help, or just a crutch?
People use it for all of those things. Coffee is a stimulant. So it can, by improving focus and your ability to do things, it helps the other two things.
Okay.
So that is what people go for. But people don't realize that.
Yeah, they become dependent
on it.
On coffee.
Yeah.
Late night scrolling, harmless habit or brain sabotage?
Clearly, brain sabotage.
Yeah. They don't sleep and everything gets affected.
What is interesting is that these videos or whatever they're
Doom scrolling,
designed to give you that little fix. So the psychologists work on this to educate the content creators on how to keep people hooked.
Yeah.
So obviously that's not good. Yeah. It's like you handing out candies to children outside school, which will be frowned upon. Isn't it like that?
True. Therapy or nutrition, if you had to pick one for mental health?
I'd say, I know you asked me to pick up one, and I'll say why both are important. Nutrition is the foundation. It's a life, giver, right? But therapy allows you to use it to your advantage. If you have to have something for you to use it. So if you don't use it, that goes waste.
Yeah.
But if you just use something without having some substance in it, you're not going to use anything. Yeah. So it's very important that you're nutritionally aligned, balanced. At the same time, you also understand how to use that. So both of them have to be together. So if you could,
they go hand in hand.
Yeah, so nutritional therapy.
Yeah, I was just going to say that maybe it's nutritional therapy.
Yeah. So it has to be together because as you will know, again, I bring back chef because I'm very passionate. I know that I'm not a chef, but I'm very passionate about the process of cooking. You need to have the best ingredients and the best skills to make the best food. Without one, another is not useful.
True.
Yeah.
Multitasking, superpower or the biggest scam we've been sold?
Can be a superpower if you can manage. Your ability to multitask, allows you to get ahead because that's important. But it's not just a superpower alone these days. Why? Because you've got now more gadgets which allow you to outsource some of these functions. But if you can manage multitask, go for it.
Yeah.
But if it is not your strong point, there are other things to do. So don't fret about not being able to multitask because that's not everyone's
cup of tea.
Yeah. Exactly.
One healthy habit people swear by, but you think is overrated?
Again, this could be controversial. People talk about exercise. I would say movement is better than exercise. So some form of movement is important. Because the reason why I say exercise is that puts a lot of people off. So when people say, how do we get healthy? Oh, you need to join the gym, do this, do that, do the other. I'm not against it. But particularly in the context that we are discussing, perimenopause, ADHD, that puts people off exercise. Exercise means a lot of rules and this and that and the other. Make it movement than exercise. So just don't think just exercise. No. Yeah.
Fantastic. Menopause is not a decline. It's
a transition, I would say. It's a transition to something better.
Okay. Thank you so much for your answers, Doctor. Brings me to my last segment. I call it the 1%, because 99% of our conversation is all about women, but men are a part of our lives too. So we've dedicated this one segment, 1% to them. So what is your 1% advice to the men in our lives? What can men do better to support women?
Helping them understand this and being empowered. So you can say where men can be patient, but then patient would come across as not only ignorance but also rejection. So women can be very sensitive to rejection. So be there for them when they go through that.
Yeah.
So you don't have to offer solutions. They are far more intelligent than you, fixing problems or finding solutions, but they need that co-regulation. These are the technical terms. Yeah. So you're just being there, getting all the flack.
Yeah. So just don't keep giving advice, just be there.
Just be there.
And listen.
Exactly.
Fantastic. Any parting advice for our listeners, especially the women who think they're going crazy? Do you want to tell them that they're not going crazy?
They're certainly not going crazy. It's not a character problem. It's a chemistry problem. So we need to look at chemistry, measure, manage, but basic lifestyle changes will prevent complications that come out of this. So you can prevent mental health complications and physical health complications. As I say, menopause is a transition to the next better area in your life, but that has to be managed properly. Particularly when you're ready. I always say you've been taxiing all along. Now you're ready for takeoff.
Yeah.
So that is how. Is flying better than being on the airport runway? Where people have their views, right? People might sometimes call flying is risky because you're taking off, but that's when things happen. So you need to be prepared for takeoff. So just like the crew announces, be prepared for takeoff. The journey is going to be pleasant, but you need to have your checks done well, otherwise you could crash.
Oh, I like that. Doctor, where can our listeners connect with you?
Through you.
Yeah.
Certainly we will work together. I'm all over the place anyway. So we are in Dubai. We are now collaborating with a clinic in DHCC called Chicktai Clinic. We're launching a Men of Mind program. I would say world's first. This is what we discussed yesterday. So integrated mind menopause care. And we bring in many specialists. So people are welcome to check out, and I think we'll be working together as well.
Thank you, Dr. Balu. Amazing conversation. I think a lot of my answers were surely answered today. I mean, very wonderful way, very easy way where you told us what's really happening in our brains, not just the medical terms in general. So thanks a lot for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed having the opportunity to talk to you about this, and this is very close to my heart, and I hope we can do more and more and let people take off and fly, keep flying.
Absolutely. That's a wrap for today. If this conversation resonated with you, please share it with more women, because the more we talk about it, the more empowered we become. I'm Gayu Lewis, and until next time, menopause, why pause? Let's play.